Okay, I think we're going live here. Yes, welcome to the Blind Ambition podcast with our special guest, Andrew Seaman. Andrew Seaman is, I would say, the man at LinkedIn. I'm not going to even use your real title. I think like you're everything LinkedIn. You're like the embodiment of LinkedIn. When everybody knows you through your podcasts, through your newsletter, for all the advice you give for people. So Rick and I are so excited to speak with you and just to get a sense of like what's going on. And maybe just to kick it off, Andrew, you could kind of give us maybe what do you see happening, on the platform now, aside from maybe layoffs, what other kind of things are you seeing that's trending?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for the lovely introduction. I am obviously a small part of a wonderful army of people here who do really wonderful things, and I'm very fortunate to be among them. But yeah, no, thank you again for having me. And yeah, on the platform, I think we're seeing a lot of things. Like obviously, you mentioned aside from layoffs, and I think we're seeing a lot of people, it's January, they're looking again at their careers, they're evaluating what's next for them. I think we're in a really interesting time when people have gone from a really wild roller coaster ride in the labor market to things sort of normalizing. And we were in really weird atmospheric space when it came to hiring for a while, so things are like almost normalizing, and even though it feels like a slowdown, but it's really interesting to see people sort of say like, oh, okay, things are changing a little bit again, I have to get used to that. And then I see people really dipping into sharing their knowledge more, which is really nice to see. So it's people saying like, hey, this is what I do in my industry. This is something that I've picked up along the way. And I really like seeing that on the platform because, at the end of the day, I think that's what we're all here for, is to sort of learn from each other and share with each other. So that's something that I've been seeing more of, and I'm really happy about it.
You have what is about 800 million people, members on the site?
Yeah, so around that number. I think the official tally is somewhere on our website, but yeah, it's about 800 million, I believe.
So with that, so much data, with so much information, unfortunately, or to dominate the headlines, are you seeing, more jobs being created, more jobs added? Are you seeing a lot of hiring? Are you seeing positive, basically, are you seeing positive things to outweigh kind of the negative headlines that we read all the time?
Well, I think, things shift. So a lot of times we talk about proportions here. So, we had a recent stat that I think it was, a lot of people, people are still romanticized by the idea of remote work. And I think, we saw that about 13% of our job postings last month were remote jobs. And that compared to, I think, 20% in March 2020. So remote work is sort of receding again. But overall, there still are a lot of jobs out there. But I always sort of have the caveat. I think when I say that there are a lot of jobs out there, I think the most recent data in the US is that there's 1.7 jobs for every unemployed person. But my caveat always with that data is that there are so many variables that need to align for a person to get a job. So when we say that, oh, there's 1.7 jobs available for every unemployed person, that doesn't mean that a lot of them are in the industry you want to work in. It doesn't mean that they're in the region that you live in. It doesn't mean that they're in a specific, or at least they're accepting people with your requirements or something like that. So there are all these variables that have to align. So a lot of times when people hear that there are a lot of jobs out there, they'll say, then why can't I get one? But we're talking at a 30,000-foot level. And when you get down at the ground level, it becomes much more complex. And, when you say like, oh, there's all these jobs, they may not be near you. So there are jobs out there. but it doesn't mean that it's still easy to get one. That's why, I do what I do is we try and give people the tools to increase their odds of success.
I am so glad that you said that because for the longest time, I felt like a lone voice out in the wilderness because exactly what you're talking about. Like I would write for Forbes about, the jobs report on a monthly basis, and they would always have that one job for every, X amount of people. And the same thing, I'm like, wait, stop writing that because that's not the case. Just what you said, just because their job's open. And I wonder how you feel this way too, that a lot of those jobs, they're open because people don't want those jobs. They're not the most desirable jobs. Or as you mentioned, they're not in your location, they're not compensation. So it almost misleads people to say, oh, wow, there's all these jobs open. Let me take a look, as opposed to give it some reason and nuance and context, like you're offering.
Yeah. And it could be that, there has been, like I said, just so many variables. So there could be jobs opening in sectors that we just don't have enough people who are trained to do that yet. Or maybe people have moved away from that specific training. So, we recently released our jobs on the Rise list, and one of the top jobs is truck driver.
Wait,
So,
which is, I thought, wait, gotta be to it, but that's so odd because I wouldn't think that they would be on LinkedIn, but I guess, do you have truck drivers on there?
oh yeah, we have, people from
Yeah.
every sort of type of career. And like I always tell people that regardless of what your job is, like there's dignity in all work. And it takes a lot to run a society, and from people who work in schools in the evening to people who, run cities or companies, everyone in between makes the world work. So, for truck drivers, you may not necessarily think like, oh, well, why would they be on LinkedIn? But think of all the knowledge you need to have as a truck driver. There are rules, there are regulations about how often you can drive. There are, laws about, if you've driven so much already, you have to take a break, and what can be transported, where you have to stop. There's a lot of knowledge that has to go into that. So if you're on LinkedIn, you could share that knowledge. You could share about how you found your way to being an independent contractor, working for yourself, or maybe is it better to work for a company. So there are a lot of things about the profession of being in transportation that you could share with other people, that you can look for work. So and also I think transportation is just something that's evolving. So with all the supply chain issues that we've had globally, it's something super crucial, and especially for retailers that need to get the so-called last mile in. That requires, they could get shipments. So like, if you have Walmart or Amazon, they could get their supplies to warehouses regionally, but how do you get that the last mile to people's homes? And that's something that all retailers sort of struggle with, and we've seen that over the years.
To go back to remote, now, Rick, on Blind, it seems like a lot of the people who are at Apple, Microsoft, uh, Google, they seem to want remote. Are you noticing, are they getting those jobs? And I guess, Andrew, here on LinkedIn, not as much as it was before, huh?
I think what's really interesting within the blind community is there's been a lot of discussion around certain companies requiring, transitioning basically to a flexible work schedule or a hybrid work schedule where it's not entirely in the office, but you're expected to go into the office maybe one, two, three, even four times a week. And there's been some resistance, right? Because in the last 2 years, a lot of people have adapted their lives. They might have moved to another region where coming into the office becomes increasingly difficult, if not impossible, right? If you can imagine when Twitter at the height of the pandemic said you can work wherever you want, you might have moved away from the San Francisco Bay Area and you might be in the middle of the country, or you might be somewhere rural. And when Elon Musk said, "Oh, I want people back to the office," um, you know, not everyone can just hop on a plane from the middle of America and head to the Bay Area, right, to do work. And so that's been a challenge. There's been some recent companies like TikTok in the US where they are getting rid of some of their work from home benefits like home internet reimbursements, gym reimbursements, basically making it less comfortable to work remotely to encourage people to come back. And in some other cases, there are some companies that said you must come back to the office or you can no longer work here because, our company is in office first. And I think it goes right back to what we observed in 2020. I think there's kind of like a false dichotomy between you must either be in office or you must be remote or remote friendly or full-time remote. I think at the end of the day, employees across all industries, across all type of functions, really just want autonomy, right? You want to be trusted to know how you can get your work best done. And I think forcing someone to do something, that part is what people are reacting to. It's less like whether I'm a fan of remote work or not, but I just don't like being told what to do when, perhaps the way that I'm working works well for me and I'm, just as effective or just as efficient.
Do you guys
Yeah, and
feel, I'm sorry.
oh no, and I was just gonna say too, I think, we've seen, like I said, the proportion of remote roles shrink. And really, I think what it comes down to in terms of why that is that it takes a lot to change culture. And during the pandemic, when everyone was working from home, the Wall Street Journal had a really good story where they basically surveyed a lot of the top CEOs in the country and said, what do you think is going to happen after when offices reopen? And consistently, they pretty much said, I want people back in the office because there are benefits of the serendipitous interactions where, you meet John in the hallway and they're working on a project and you could collaborate together and things like that. And, even if they said, okay, our companies are working just fine with hybrid and remote roles, that still there's this tug of decades of in office interactions that had to be undone, and at this point the power is shifting within the labor market. So we went from basically mass unemployment during the pandemic, and companies then had to basically surge hire, and the job seekers were in the driver's seat. And now the power dynamic is shifting a little bit more. So employers don't have to cater as much to the demands of job seekers right now. So they can say, no, I would like you back in the office. And the job seeker doesn't have enough power really in the economy. Like it's all kind of about power dynamics to make that case as much as they did. So that's sort of, I think, why we're seeing the remote jobs to recede a little bit. Maybe it'll come back once the pendulum swings again, because of course it will. That's how these things work. But it depends on when that is and what the state of play is at that time.
So it sounds like you see a correlation between the employers having more power compared to where it was a couple of years ago to saying, hey, we want you back in the office. And that might be for people who are watching it now, if they're wondering what's going on, why am I not seeing as many remote jobs as I did before? So I guess it's a shift now where they're trying to get people back. But as you mentioned, once the market gets back again and everything is great, you probably will see the remote jobs pop up again. Is that maybe kind of a fair statement?
Yeah, and I think it depends on what people are used to at that time and how long it takes for the pendulum to swing back. And also something that is important to note too is that competition for those remote roles are really high. So like I said, they're about 13, I think it's 13.2% last month, the proportion of jobs that are remote. More than half of all applications go to those roles. So the competition for those
Wow.
roles are really high. So it's still good as an employer to be offering those because you're getting your pick of talent.
So that's a really interesting. So not only are there less jobs, but when they're open for remote roles, intensity, in terms of everyone trying to get those few roles that are open.
Yep.
Wow. Are are you seeing other kinds of trends happening now that, there are layoffs, downsizing, hiring freezes, where maybe the employees don't have as much power? Are you seeing any other things playing out?
Um, you know, it's difficult to, especially since things are in flux right now. Obviously, data takes time. We do have an amazing team here at LinkedIn called the Economic Graph Team, and one of the most amazing things about LinkedIn is that we have economists here that get to look at the numbers and sort of see what could be coming. And if people go to Karen Kimbrough's LinkedIn profile, she's our chief economist. They'll see that we have some newsletters that we put out, and they just put out something about 2 weeks ago about sort of the global economy and what they see coming. And basically, obviously, no surprise. I think they're hopefully I'm characterizing this correctly. They saw a slowdown coming, but the U.S. was resistant, and really it depends on where you are, because obviously the situation in Europe is different than the situation in Asia, then is different than in North America and things like that. So there's a slowdown, but I think mild recession was one of the words that was used and things like that. But yeah, so I would really encourage people who are really interested in that and what LinkedIn data says to go to the economic graph team's page and their profiles, because they're always putting really great trend pieces out. And then we pick them up when we can and add them to our reporting.
Rick, on your platform there, are you seeing the Amazons of the world try to push people back into the office as well?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing in terms of overall trends outside of the remote work dynamic is a decrease or a drop in the total compensation that some of these workers are receiving. And so that total compensation could be kind of the lost benefits, you know, the remote work benefits that go away in terms of coverage for your gym membership or home Wi-Fi or utility bills or office furniture. We're also seeing because of these hiring freezes and just reduced hiring because of these layoffs. Um, it is very difficult for a Google, a Meta, a Amazon, a very highly paid, technical, knowledge based professional to command that same kind of compensation at another company, right? Where I would say 1 year ago, it wasn't uncommon for someone to have an offer from Amazon, Google, Apple, Meta, and use those offers to compete and try to get these companies to bid up their offers. It becomes very difficult when, let's say, you're at Amazon, you were laid off. Previously, you might have tried to shop around with Meta, Google, but those companies have also reduced their hirings. They might have implemented hiring freezes in certain departments or functions. And now you have less of that kind of bargaining power, that less of a smaller chip to play, so to speak. And so we're starting to see the number of offers some of our professionals are reporting going down, and then the dollar value from those offers going down as well. And that's not even counting the stock-based compensation that many of these professionals get. When there's concerns about a recession, the markets tend to be a bit more volatile. And when your or when your compensation is based on that stock, uh, that can have a swing as well.
Andrew, Rick, on a positive side, maybe, are there roles that if you want to pivot So let's say in your sector, let's say tech sector, it might be soft with, I think the last I read, layoffs, FYI, was like 160,000. I could be wrong about this. I'm doing it off the top of my head. 160,000 tech people were laid off in January alone. Andrew, are there, in addition to the trucking we talked about, are there other areas that your data shows that there's a lot of growth in certain types of jobs that maybe people could take their skills and cross over?
Yeah, and I think it's important also to note that the tech space is really interesting because, well, and it's not necessarily exclusive to tech, but I'm a journalist and I work in tech. I that's my background. We have people here who work in audio production, and so tech. Even though you work for a tech company, you might have no idea. Like I have no idea how to code, things like that. So if people do get let go from a tech company, there are a lot of options out there because their skills can be utilized in a lot of different spaces. And especially if you are on the actual tech side, where you can code, think of all of the places that can use those skills. So whether it's like a casino, whether it's a hospital, those places, it's really interesting, because I think a lot of times people get caught up with the word tech and they'll think, oh, these are a bunch of like people who are coding on computers, when that's part of it, but there's a much bigger part of it, that is nothing to do with that. And when it comes to sort of the list that we just released, it's really interesting because there's so many different positions on that list. And I always like the list when we get the data back where we see people from a range of different backgrounds. And like you said, truck driver is on there. Head of revenue was on there. We had a lot of HR roles in there. And obviously a lot of people think like, Becky in HR or something like that. But HR is much bigger than that too. And we have HR analytic roles. And what we're seeing is that companies are being a lot smarter with how they hire and thinking a little bit more thoughtfully about their workforces, because I think the pandemic was sort of a weird wake-up call for a lot of companies where they shed a ton of jobs very quickly, and then when things got back to somewhat normal, I'm not going to say normal, but there was some resurgence of business very soon after. A lot of businesses were sort of on their back foot because they sort of didn't expect that so quickly. And then they were losing out on business because they didn't have the talent. I think everyone remembers the signs in like restaurant windows that said, sorry, we're closed Tuesday because, our server had to take the day off, those sort of things. And so we're seeing a lot of roles in the talent space where it's like employee experience. How do we keep the great talent that we have? HR analytics. How do we actually create a workforce that can withstand uncertainty in the economy? So that's the tech role there. You have diversity and equity and inclusion in there too. If you do layoffs, how do you make sure you maintain a diverse workforce so you don't lose the gains that you've already done? And then there are positions in healthcare. There are a lot of different things that people can take their talent in. And what's really good is the list that we put out. It is the fastest growing jobs, but we look at 5 years of data. So these aren't flash in the pan roles. This isn't something that is going to go away next year. These are roles that over 5 years has shown staying power. So they're not necessarily recession proof by any means, but they at least are areas where companies have made consistent investments in. So, if you're leaving tech industry, depending on where you are, there's a good chance, and obviously, like we talked about a little bit before we went live, there's a good chance that there's a place for you. And I think there's some data showing that they're finding roles relatively quickly. Obviously there's probably some noise in the data there, but I think people that are leaving places like Amazon or Google or places like that, that's a good name to have on your resume. And if you go to your local healthcare system or something like that. They're going to say, we want your talent.
Because I've seen in the Wall Street Journal, I think Business Insider, ZipRecruiter stories saying that people who lost their jobs pretty quickly, I would say, I don't know, anywhere from 30 days to 3 months would find a comparable job. Sometimes they would say even more money. To me, as a recruiter, that seems really super quick. But is it that maybe, as you just mentioned, because the marquee brand you have on your resume, they're just going to swoop in and say, hey, this is my chance to get that person. A year ago, 2 years ago, I would not be able to get that person with that kind of pedigree. Now I can. I'm doing it. Is that maybe what's happening?
It could be like I don't obviously I haven't looked at that data, but
Yeah,
I've seen the data reported on, and
right.
like Rick mentioned, if you move, if you were based in San Francisco, New York, or Los Angeles, or one of the coasts, and during the pandemic you said, I want to move to Omaha, or I want to move to Sun Valley or something like that. Yeah, if you worked for a marquee brand and you went to somewhere more local, because maybe you don't want to move back to the coast, maybe you like your life where you are, that could be one factor at play here.
Interesting.
It could be that maybe people are dipping out of the workforce for a little bit. Maybe they have savings and they say, hey, I just want to take some time. Maybe they're doing some freelance work, consulting work. I think I see a lot of people do that when they get laid off. If they have some means to get themselves set up, they'll say, I don't want a full-time job, but I'll take contract work. So I think there's a lot of things people are doing. And again, there are people who will get a job overnight. There are people who will not get a job for maybe 4 months or 5 months. And it really depends, like we said, on all those variables and whether they align and what you want, if what you want aligns with what an employer wants. Um, you know, yeah, when job searching careers, I think especially the old saying where it says comparison is the thief of joy. I think that's very true for job
Yeah, It's
searching and
it's so
careers.
true, Andrew, because like that's what I think freaks out people because you could say, wow, how did Jack get a job that quickly? And I'm looking, this is 3 months. And what I've seen over like 25 years of recruiting, sometimes it's just luck. Like, are you in the right place at the right time? Because someone can
Mhm.
have like amazing skills, fantastic background, wonderful person, and you just don't have that right job at that time. And then someone else you watch you're like, well, that person's a knucklehead. How did they just get that job right away? What's
Yeah,
wrong? And I think that's what like hurts people's self-esteem when they can't like figure out why is this happening?
there's always the X factor where it's
Yeah.
you reliably know every other letter in the alphabet and how it aligns with your job search, but then there's X and you never know what that is. You never know how that's going to come into play. It could be that you hit the wrong button when you were applying and it was a knockout question. It could be that the boss's cousin decided to apply for a job and they were completely unqualified, but they had the best qualification ever. They were the boss's cousin. So you never know what that one X factor is going to be.
I'm glad you say because that's the wild card. It's not like a math equation. If you do
Mm.
1 and 1, it's 2, and you get the job. It doesn't always
Yeah,
work that
and
way.
that's why it bothers me sometimes when I see job coaches or career coaches where they
Yeah.
say, this is the one thing you need to do. And there might be one thing that you can do to set yourself up for success, but nothing's ever a guarantee. So what you always want to do is make sure that you're putting yourself in a position where the odds are in your favor. It doesn't mean that you're going to beat the odds, or it doesn't mean that the odds are going to be a sure thing, but the odds, you want them to at least align where it's going to point in the right direction for you.
And Rick, I've seen it from you guys, some reports, and from Andrew, from your reports. I don't know if I've seen anything recently, but from time to time they'll say, "Hey, here's where people are going and moving." To your earlier point, where maybe you don't want to stay in New York or San Francisco, and you're going, I'll make this up, Jacksonville, Florida, or somewhere somewhere in Carolina, and that maybe there's a better chance of getting a job in a smaller market and doing that. So you kind of see that from LinkedIn a lot and some other platforms too, where you just see that migration. And that might be a theory, well, for people too, to say, hey, maybe I shouldn't stay in the big city, high taxes, expensive houses, but I can't even maybe afford a house with now high interest rates. Let me go somewhere else.
I think what we're seeing more in terms of mobility that's also contributing to finding a job more easily or more quickly is the willingness to switch industries, right? So, um, I think it's very easy to focus on these headlines, these like huge marquee numbers like 10,000, 18,000, 10%, 20, 30%. They're primarily in the tech industry, and the tech industry is not the entire economy, right? There are so many jobs that are just not tech related, even with our kind of modernization of the economy, even with like digitizing everything. There are entire industries within services, healthcare, financial services, even that are just growing. Recently, a major airline reached out to me trying to recruit me to be a PR person, right? Travel is booming, right? That's services. Uh, and I think that
Are you
willingness
just
to
saying that to
branch
get a
out.
raise, or is that?
Yeah, my boss that's listening, FYI, hint, hint. I think that is, I mean, I just use that as an example because I would have never considered that industry at all, right? And that's as someone that's kind of like a little bit of a flight geek that I love to fly, and I would never think that that's an opportunity that might be open to me, right? We've also seen some kind of interesting data recently. At the time of this airing, it's January 2023. It's kind of bonus season for banks, and I think everyone focuses on, oh, well, no one's buying a house. So in terms of like banking and finance, it might not be the best place. Oh, no one's making any like merger, acquisition, IPO deals. So if you're on the investment banking side, it's going to be a bad bonus season for you. But what we've seen on Blind is, sure, there are these traders and bankers that are disappointed by their bonuses, maybe compared to last year or years previous. But engineers or folks on the tech side, they're pretty happy with their bonuses. They're getting full bonuses or large bonuses, and their peers on the tech side, they might be getting laid off, right? And so having that willingness to kind of explore and just realize like, oh, a lot of my skills might be directly translatable to someone else, right? Or in another industry, another geography. I'm also bringing my big company or my big city or my, in the root startup like experience that can really have an incredible impact, and you're going to get compensated accordingly.
Andrew, do you notice? I'm curious. I kind of have this thing I'm trying to wrestle with. In past, you talked about a possible recession earlier on, and usually it's the blue collar workers, the frontline workers that bear the brunt when things go bad. But this time around, it seems like it's more of a white collar recession, and which is very different. And I wonder, Andrew, do you think there's this kind of contagion effect that once one company says, hey, we're laying off X amount, it frees up the next company to say, we could do that too. And then before you know it, just what we've seen, that just steady flow of layoffs. And if so, how does that end? Or does it just keep going on? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, like I obviously this is just my own opinion, but
Yeah, yeah.
I assume there is some sort of like shielding effect where, it's sort of like, well, if we all go at the same time, we can sort of blunt the bad and negative experiences that we'll get. Like I don't think any company, any boss ever wants to lay people off. But, I think at the same time you see people who lay off, they sometimes hire, and a lot of times it's again like workforce um regulation almost, where you say, listen, I I hired far too many people on this side, and now I need more people on this side. So a lot of them might be level setting, um, where a business unit just disappears and they say, listen, we just don't need this business unit anymore. So, I'm sure that there is probably some of that where they say, listen, we have to get rid of a few people because we did go through this ridiculous surge in hiring. And what goes up must come down. And, so I think probably they look at the books and say, we do need to shed some people here. And it could be because they need to streamline their operations, or they look into the future and say, okay, if we do hit a rocky economy, do we have too many people for the amount of work that we'll have? And also, I think that there's a question of like, if we do let people go and business returns booming very quickly, we will still be able to handle that. So, there's a lot that probably go into those decisions, and I'm just happy that I don't have to make them. but yeah, I'm sure that there is some of that. Like, if we all go together, and I don't know how it stops, but hopefully it's because I don't think anyone willingly does that. So they only do it if they need to.
What I find interesting too, I don't know if you guys noticed this, but you hear the headline risk, and the media loves to give fear, right? Like 10,000, 20, 50,000, and everyone's freaked out. But then when I'm crunching the numbers, and I think I just wrote about this the other day, when I crunch the numbers, the amount of people, to your point, Andrew, what you mentioned before, that were hired since, let's say, 2019 to almost now, huge numbers. So that when you factor in even the 10,000 at a clip, they're still way net up from years ago. So the head count is huge, but I think that goes underreported because it's not sexy, and it's not going to get people to click on the article and read it because it's not screaming like, oh my God, the layoff. So when you factor it in, it doesn't seem, this is sound weird, but it doesn't seem as bad as it's made out to look. Am I crazy, or have you guys noticed
Um,
that?
Well, actually, funny you should mention that. Someone did come to me today and said, "Hey, about the net positive, and that between 2019 and now, or even from 2020 to now, a lot of the FANG companies are still actually up quite a bit." And it's one of those things where it's sort of like, I don't know how apt the comparison is, or how useful that number is. So I was sort of like, I don't think this actually does anything to help anyone other than say like, oh, they still hired more people over this time, because there could be more layoffs on the way. And at the end of the day, there are still a lot of people who lost their jobs. So it's difficult to know how useful that number is. I think like it's interesting to see, but at the same time, like I wouldn't necessarily use it as comfort, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, one thing that gives me comfort, one thing that is nice, that on LinkedIn, I've seen rather so much warmth and so much camaraderie in terms of the layoffs, meaning that you find people who are just setting up spreadsheets. Here's who's hiring, here's people who lost their job. Can you help them? And it's actually seems really nice that in a time of need, people are stepping up big time. And I see that, Rick, where you are too, where, it's become like, hey, I'm going to try to help out however I can. Have you seen that too, Andrew? Or do you pay close attention to that?
Yeah, there's I think there's always those spreadsheets that go around, and you see people who say, if I could be of any help. One thing that I always recommend to people is to give people LinkedIn recommendations. If their friends or colleagues are being laid off, I think that's one of the things that you can do that's very low lift effort. That way, when people go to their LinkedIn profiles, you have that built in, like, hey, I worked with Barbara on X amount of projects, and she delivered on results time after time. So you could just do low lift things like that even. But yeah, I think there is a lot of camaraderie, and I think also that stems from, I think, a lot of people's experience during the pandemic is that, so many people were out of work so suddenly that they remember, oh, this could be me. So of all the pain that was caused by the pandemic, there were some, I think, positives that come out of it, which is, I think there's much less stigma about unemployment. There's a lot of people have created more distance between themselves and their work, which I think is never a bad thing. And then there's the idea of, oh, this happens sometimes in a person's career.
I think what's really interesting is it can be very easy to kind of go down this like doom spiral, right? Where you work in tech, you get laid off, or you're concerned about getting laid off because you just read all of these headlines, and it just seems like, oh my gosh, every company is playing follow the leader. And you go in a place like Blind, and people are giving each other referrals. And it's a good signal, right? Where, oh wow, someone's willing to go out of their way to help me find a job. It's also a signal that there are companies that are actively hiring and are desperate to find people, right? Where they're incentivizing their employees, or just their employees out of the goodness of their heart are trying to fill the seat next to them on their team, in their function in their business unit. And I think again, it's kind of similar to like if people are willing to go out of an industry that they currently work in, or they think uh might not be open to them, like go and explore that, because there are companies, a lot of teams out there that are desperate to hire. And I think even in like tech heavy cities like San Francisco and Seattle, the unemployment rate is still incredibly low, even with these like marquee numbers, right? There, I believe in San Francisco, it's less than 3%, the unemployment rate. And so that there are a lot of jobs out there. And so you don't have to kind of think like, oh no, like I can't get anywhere, or oh no, this might be taking a long time than I expected. Um, Eventually it will click. And there are these opportunities out there that are just waiting.
Andrew, from the data, you have the economists, you have, all these smart folks at LinkedIn, and with 800 million plus people, are you able to kind of put together data or put the pieces of the puzzle together to gain maybe a sense of where things are headed?
Well, yeah, the economists, they look at that, and like I said, it's really interesting to read a lot of their reports. One of the things about LinkedIn is we do have a lot of data, but um, it's always under lock and key, even internally. So we let the data scientists, analyze that in a most responsible way. So I'm definitely not out there playing with everyone's data. But
Yeah.
but yeah, like I said, they can see what's happening, and they see based on probably what is happening on the platform, what the US government is seeing, what the World Bank is seeing, and they say what they come up with their estimates. And they have their own newsletters and things like that. But it is interesting to see um you know what they predict, and also it gives some reassurance. So like a lot of times I think people see headlines and things like that, but when I read what our economists put out, and obviously like I said, that's open to everyone. If you go to Google, you can just type in LinkedIn economic graph and you could find all of that data. And there's some pretty cool tools actually on their website that the economic graph puts together. I actually find them reassuring because like the economy goes up and down,
Yes.
that there are cycles, but for the most part, I remember LinkedIn puts together an event called Talent Connect, and it was in September in Los Angeles, and I had a chance to sit down with our chief economist, and I told her she's the highlight of the conference because she said the sky's not falling. And I still see that in their reporting. So I find solace in that too. So even it's nice to
Yeah.
see camaraderie, but it's also nice to see very smart people say, things are going to be okay. It might get tough for a little bit, but the sky's not falling.
Yeah, I agree. It's for whatever reason, we have this boom and bust economy. You go from, even back to, let's say, just 1987 with the crash. And then if you look at a graph of like where stocks performed afterwards, it just kind of kept going up. Then you have the dot-com boom and bust. You have 9/11 and its after effect. You have the financial crisis. You have the beginning of the pandemic. It's just back and forth and back and forth. And I agree with you. So now, eventually it's going to turn around. If you don't mind, if I could ask you one last question, just if you don't mind, if I'm a little personal, how does it feel to be the cool, hot platform of all the social media sites lately? Because that's it, man. Everyone's going on LinkedIn to know what's happening. How does that feel?
I would say that we've always been the cool hip place that people should be.
Especially now.
Yeah, no,
different levels, I guess.
um, you
And
know,
blinders too. So don't get me wrong. I mean, but it's like all of a sudden, man, these are places like, I think is that because people want to come together when they're not sure what's happening and just listen and hear from what other people are thinking.
I think a lot of it has to do with people re-examining their relationship with their careers and work. And frankly, having, I think, a more healthy perspective. I always think I always think that the fundamentals don't necessarily change when it comes to careers or the workplace. We always see like quiet quitting and rage applying and all that stuff, and that's all been around forever. It's just that they have a fancy new name to it. But I think people, whatever happened during the pandemic, whatever culturally Gen Z brings to the workforce, the millennials, I think it's getting us to a healthier place. And I think people come to LinkedIn and they see that part of them exist in their careers, but also, work is work sometimes. And I think, people flocking to LinkedIn, there's just some sort of cohesion with that, or some sort of overlap where it's like, oh, this is part of me, my work is part of me, but it's not all of me. And I think we're seeing that manifest on LinkedIn. And someone recently told me, and they didn't work at LinkedIn, but they were going between New York and DC on Amtrak, and they said there was a group of like really young people, not, and when I say really young, I'm speaking from mid 30s, so they're probably like early 20s, and they were talking about how much they use LinkedIn, and the person texted me
And
and
you're
they
like,
said, these people, well, they texted me and they said, these kids behind me won't stop talking about how much they use LinkedIn. And I said, hey, it's the cool place to be. But I just think that from a population level, I think we're seeing people re-examine their careers, their work, and I think we're seeing that manifest on the platform. And I think, our leadership does a really good job at figuring out, like, how do we be the best platform for our members where they are right now? So it's sort of meeting the moment. So I'm obviously very happy here.
Well, that's great. That's great. Any other last words you have? You guys have for people who are just trying to figure out what to do. And any other words of wisdom before we say goodbye?
I think I have one kind of pro tip for the job seekers in the audience. It's to look at these like not as marquee companies, right? Look at these smaller companies. Oftentimes they can hire faster. Blind has a recruiting agency called Talent by Blind, and some of our clients they're letting you skip the first like phone screen if you work with us, right? Because you can go straight into like the chat with the hiring manager or straight into the technical challenge. And I think going back to like Jack, your point about how are people finding these jobs so quickly? I think there's a bit of that, right? There are these smaller, maybe even mid-sized companies that are kind of like licking their lips, right? And saying, oh my gosh, they're drooling like there's such great talent out there. I'm in a rush to hire. I've always needed to hire. How can I make it easy to stand out as an employer of choice? And so a lot of them, they're adjusting their benefits, they're adjusting their interview process, they're adjusting how quickly they can hand out offers. They're being more transparent about their pay and what it's like to work on the team, work at their company. And so it's worth considering and thinking outside the box.
Yeah. And I would say, at least for me, definitely I would plus one that is that don't overlook small companies because usually it comes with more freedom. And I think we're seeing a lot more people across an age spectrum say, I kind of want to do a few different things. So, like, I think we've seen the rise of the side hustle more than anything over the past few years. And especially among younger people, I think we're seeing them say, like, hey, I don't want to just be this one thing. I want to be this and a content creator. I want to be this and a chef. And so it's kind of really interesting to see. And I think that leads me into my other piece of advice is don't be afraid to take a risk. And I always there was someone in grad school, so professor, his name's Sig Gisler, who used to be the administrator of the Pulitzer Prizes, and he didn't invent this, but all the professors on the first day of class, they were allowed to give everyone a piece of advice, and he said, keep an open mind, but don't let your brain fall out. And I always think that's great for life, but also your career. It's like take a risk, but also just be smart about it. Like, and internally here at LinkedIn, we talk about taking intelligent risk. And sometimes it pays off, sometimes it doesn't. If it doesn't pay off, you move on to the next thing. But don't be afraid to take a risk because at the end of the day, you're going to be in your career for 30, 40, 50 years, and you're not going to like every day of your job. When they say, do something you love and you'll never work a day in your life, that person is lying through their teeth. Sometimes work is work. And you want to at least set yourself up so that you're not miserable at work. So if you think you could be happier and you want to take a little bit of a risk, go for it.
I love it. And I love you. I love your transparency. So like you're just call it the way it is. And that's fantastic. That's great. I love it. I love
well,
it.
there's no point in, people will find out if you're not honest eventually. So.
Well, I really appreciate you taking time because I know you're busy. Like I said at the beginning of the hour when you started talking, the podcast, the newsletter, everything you're doing. I know you're a busy guy, so I really appreciate you taking time out. And I think it's so helpful because everybody's just trying to figure out, what do I do? How do I get through this? What's going on? So one of the things that just personally, selfishly, I enjoy doing is these kind of conversations because I know it's helping people because I know they're afraid, they're scared, they don't know, they're confused. So if we could offer a little color, a little advice, a little guidance, that's great. It's helpful. So you're amazing, Andrew. You never fail to always come up and just have great things to say and very wise and have so much knowledge to impart. And I really appreciate you taking the time and coming on our podcast and talking about it. It's awesome. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. No, thank you for having me. And you always also are always doing really great work, and you're a really great voice on LinkedIn and Forbes everywhere. So I appreciate it. And it's been great getting to know you, Rick.
It's nice to meet you, Andrew.
Thank you.